Go. Well, we are glad you are with us for this last panel of the day in the Faith Pavilion. This is a story of the Episcopal Church, a case study in faith-based advocacy and witness. I'm the Reverend Melanie Mullen. I'm the Episcopal Church Director for Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care. And you are going to hear from 5 Episcopalians who have been a part of a decades-long struggle in allyship and in fight. This is an incredible story. It seems impossible that low-budget, grassroots folks out of church basements and parish halls were able to take on the oil industry across national borders for real change. And what we've learned from Indigenous leaders, from women and girls in parishes, about environmental advocacy and action as they took on Capitol Hill and major corporations has taught us a lot about faith and about climate justice. So these humble workers have been doing this fight, as I said, for decades. And you might not know the word ANWR, or Arctic National Wildlife Reserve, but this was the Great Last Wilderness, born in response to folks who cared about the world, marking out a place for holiness. And yet, starting with our Reagan administration in the 1980s, Congress let the barriers open, and therefore, the lands that were sacred and gave life and holiness and food to communities of indigenous communities for generations were under threat. These lands were called the biological heart of Alaska. They were that important. And yet, it was church folks, local parish folks, who asked institutions and businesses and bishops to listen. And so we learned about being allies, we learned about fossil fuel extraction, and we learned about how to tell a story about the fight for climate justice. So we have on Zoom today experts from across the church field. We have the Right Reverend Dr. Mark Andrus, who is the Bishop of California and the head of the Episcopal Church COP delegation. We also have Ms. Susie Faria, who is our Episcopal Church analyst for our Office of Government Relations in Washington, D.C., another former member of COP delegations. We have here on the stage with me Dr. Delia Heck, who is a professor and scientist of geography at Ferrum College in Virginia and leader of our denominational-wide Environmental Justice Committee. And we also have on the Zoom Reverend Rachel Tabor Hamilton, who is, in fact, our vice president of our Episcopal denomination's deputies and members, and she is a parish priest and a member of the Shakan First Nations people. Together, we are going to hear this story, this incredible work of activism and environmental justice. And so I'd like to invite first up our head of delegation, our Bishop Mark Andrus, to tell us a little bit about this story and the likely role of the church being allies for indigenous land and rights. Bishop Andrus. And if we can put him in the center of the screen.
Perhaps you can hear me. Can you? Yeah, hi.
We can hear you.
Thank you for that great introduction to this whole panel, Reverend Melanie. That was inspiring already. Your energy and your knowledge is helpful to all of us. It's a great thing to be in this panel together. I know and respect and love all of these panelists. I've been a bishop in the Episcopal Church for 23 years, so my tenure doesn't stretch all the way back to the Reagan administration, thankfully, but I've known this struggle for the whole time I've been a bishop in the Episcopal Church and have had a role in it, a role that I'm grateful for. So I want to speak a little bit to what I understand about it as a way to introduce you to some of the real workers in this area. So we're the Episcopal Church. We're an international religious body that is part of a global religious body. So we are comprised of many countries and also many peoples. 17 countries that are parties to the United Nations are comprised what is the Episcopal Church. And we are part of the global body called the Anglican Communion, which is the third largest religious Christian body in the world, about 88 million people. Those peoples within the Episcopal Church include indigenous peoples, and they were included in the Episcopal Church and in the Anglican Communion through colonization. During colonization, some indigenous people embraced Christianity. Christianity is a world religion, we call it that, both because it carries a universal message. That's the positive message. But also because Christianity was a stream of the expression of colonizing power. This colonizing power prominently included the Church of England and later the offshoot of the Church of England, the Episcopal Church. We did our own colonizing. In the present, we are learning what it means to decolonize our church. We are learning how to live as a multicultural body that manifests what we call the beloved community. That is what the New Testament calls the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. We call it now increasingly the beloved community. It's characterized by mutuality, respect, being a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects, and by peace among all the members, and by overflowing love. And we believe it includes all of life, not just Episcopalians, not just Christians, not just people who claim one of the world's faiths, nor only humans, but all of life. That means that all of life is equally sacred to those who embrace the beloved community. Within that big vision, we are learning to stand with each other to prevent exploitation and domination. This is very practical work, lobbying the United States Congress and administration for those of us who live in the United States in the Episcopal Church. For instance, indigenous advocates and allies are all aided by a professional team of policy experts who work as part of the Episcopal Church administration. This team, the Office of Government Relations, is based in Washington, D.C., and is represented, as you heard from the Reverend Melanie, by Ms. Susie Faria. Spiritually, too, I want to add that the colonizing church is being transformed itself as a whole by indigenous people who themselves embraced Christianity and also retained their spiritual traditions and worldviews. I am not personally equipped to experience the world of the Gwich'in or the Inupiat people, but my work side by side with them and also with the Lakota people has helped me move in that direction. So this work of mutually together protecting, led by the people themselves, by the Gwich'in people in this case, for their goals of protecting that precious strip of land that is the coastal part of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which they call the sacred place where life begins. This is work that we consider sacred to us as well, and which we are blessed to be invited into by the leadership of the Gwich'in people. One elder of the Gwich'in tribe said to me, for perhaps 14,000 years, we have been in a relationship with the porcupine caribou herd. And for all that time, almost all that time, we, the Gwich'in people, have depended on them. Now, he said, they depend on us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bishop Mark. Bishop Mark is a hero to so many who are champions of faith and action and allyship for climate justice. And we've heard over and over again at this COP and previous COPs that the way to make change is to make sure that the table is balanced. The call for women to be at the table, for indigenous people to be at the table, for affected communities to define our path. And so now I want to invite Reverend Rachel Tabor Hamilton to give us a taste of what that could be like. and what we are learning as the Episcopal Church when we invite the table to be set by those who know the land and its priorities. Reverend Gabriel Hamilton. So just unmute yourself. There you go.
Thank you very much, Melanie. I appreciate being with my fellow panelists. I'm honored to be with you today. The indigenous people of the Episcopal Church are providing a kind of leadership for all of us that we've, I think, heard a longing for in terms of how can a Christian tradition, which has a long history of being weaponized through colonialism, become part of the healing of the planet and the healing of peoples. So there's lessons from indigenous communities that have been a part of their landscapes and their environments for thousands of years, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years going back. So where I'd like to begin is, as Bishop Andrus was sharing with us, we have the background a little bit of what's happening for the Quechin. And that goes back to a little bit of American history, because public lands, parklands, public lands in the United States have always been created by the removal and displacement of indigenous people. And it's also true for the Quechin people of Alaska and Canada, who today continue to have to fight to preserve their culture and their food sovereignty against large oil companies in the Arctic. The Quechin of Arctic Village, Alaska, have long opposed fossil fuel development in that area, and the Inupiat of Kaktovik are at times in support of it because of their economic base. However, the media attention that covers the Arctic refuge controversy often depicts this issue as a dominant culture issue only, as though it is environmental white activists environmentalists, versus the oil industry. So we need to look again at what the Quechin people are doing, who in Arctic Village are predominantly Episcopalian. And this Arctic refuge has been long understood as not only one of the largest wildlife refuges in the U.S., but also one of the most sensitive. It's approximately 19 million acres, equivalent to the size of the state of South Carolina. And that those ecosystems, they were considered at first by dominant culture as being something that tourists should be able to have access to. So when we see through the eyes of the indigenous Quechin, we understand how close they live to that. And it isn't just for them something to just go and enjoy and hike around in. It's something that is their way of life. So this refuge was originally established in 1960 by President Eisenhower, and for its recreational values. And in 1980, President Carter signed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, also known as ANCILA, which created that refuge that we know today. It's also referred to as Section 1002 of ANCILA. But it all told is 1.5 million acres of land along the Arctic coastline that is called the coastal plain. Now, ANCILA left the coastal plain in intentional legislative limbo, granting the authorization to oil and gas development to be figured out by future Congresses. So the coastal plain is the most contentious area of the Arctic refuge overall, where disputes between the fossil fuel developers and the Quechin originate. So in that sensitive ecosystem, it is the primary calving ground of the porcupine caribou herd. And upon the Quechin people, it's so important because they rely on that as food, but also the caribou are the central aspect of the way of life and of language and of generational knowledge of the Quechin people. So when we talk about preserving the environment, preserving caribou, we cannot ever disassociate those things from people, from the indigenous people who are there. Biologists say that the area of the coastal plain is a vital component to the health of the porcupine caribou. And I would say it's the central element to the life of the Gwich'in people. So in that area of this very sensitive calving ground, subsistence activities such as hunting and gathering and fishing are the vital aspects of survival and cultural integrity of the Gwich'in. Many times I hear dominant culture folks talk about subsistence as though it is a lesser than economy or a lesser than kind of lifestyle. It's not highly valued. It's not consumeristic. It's not all these things that are associated with success in dominant culture. Subsistence or living with the land, living with the animals and the plants that are there, I believe is the primary relationship to which all people actually need to aspire. It is the way of life that holds the values, not only of indigenous people, but it holds the values of Christian people, or at least those who would like to say that they are respecting God's creation. Yes. Now, the Gwich'in have been protesting development in this area in several ways. By advancing legislation, by creating partnerships with major companies such as Patagonia to raise environmental awareness on their behalf, and by filing lawsuits against companies that attempt to drill in that 1002 area. In 1988, members of the Gwich'in Nation traveled from their communities throughout Alaska and Canada, and they all got together and went to Washington, D.C. They were responding to a proposal of oil drilling in the Arctic Refuge. And soon after that first protest in 1988, the Gwich'in Steering Committee was established. One of their statements reads like this: "Our elders recognized that oil development in caribou calving grounds was a threat to the very heart of our people. They called upon the chiefs of the Gwich'in villages from Canada to Alaska to come together for a traditional gathering, the first in over a century, having formerly been prohibited by missionaries. At the gathering in Arctic Village, we addressed the issue with a talking stick in accordance with our traditional way and decided unanimously that we would speak with one voice against oil and gas development in the birthing and nursing grounds of the porcupine caribou herd. Our unified voice is expressed in a formal resolution." Since its establishment, the Gwich'in Steering Committee has continued to raise awareness of the Arctic Refuge controversy, and it's highlighted the fact that it is an issue of human rights. Again, dominant culture tends to place the environment as an object or a thing it tends to place animals as objects and things. And if we re-spirit our land and our animals and those which all of our relations with whom we have relationship, if we re-spirit them and see them as peoples in their own right, then the Gwich'in people are simply one, and yet so intimately connected to all the other peoples of that area, that when we talk about preserving or conserving environmentalism, we are also needing to understand that this is human rights, that we are also needing to advocate, that we are also needing to uphold. The Gwich'in and the Steering Committee have reframed the controversy over the Arctic Refuge and are challenging a long colonial history of indigenous exclusion and erasure from public lands that were taken from them. The Gwich'in have turned this fight into a fight for environmental justice and human rights. So I would like to see if I can share with you a brief video. I'm going to go and see if I can share my screen with you to do this. I am not seeing anything on my screen, though I have shared the screen.
Here we go. We see what you are intending to share. So thank you.
Okay, because I am not seeing it. Let me just.
We have a video of Kivalina. Yep. Thank you. You can go ahead and start.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I cannot.
We got it.
See
We got it.
look at the state of Alaska, you'll see a face, from the side. And we are right there where the eye is. That is where things will happen, because we are at the eye, and they will start in Kivalina. If your whole island is sinking, there hasn't been very much
You're showing the Kivalina video. I was trying to share my
sinking?
screen to do something else, but your host has started the Kivalina.
Except to say that we have to get off the island. In 2004, our land started failing. It started falling into the ocean. We had our usual fall storm from the south. And there's a lot of wind, and that happens every year. For many years before that, we were seeing changes. Our ice was not forming the way it used to. I mean, Alaska is about 70% wetland. In the storm surge analysis, they said that Kivalina is in imminent danger of flooding. And if that happens, we'll be under 4 to 6 feet of water. Our people used to go out whaling every year and set up camps for weeks at a time on the ice. We haven't done that for years now, because the ice is not forming to the thickness that it once did, and so it's unsafe. Actually, it's melting from the bottom now. Before that, the ice would stay, and it would, as the sun got warmer in the springtime, it would melt the top. But now, right now, it's melting from the bottom. We brought up the possibility of filing a lawsuit. It wasn't just climate change. It was how Kivalina problems were handled. It was inevitable. Some people from the media actually came and said, whose idea was it, That was the first question out of their mouths. For people to come and say, that these people in Kivalina don't make their own decisions. They're influenced by conservation groups, environmental interest groups, or lawyers. Nobody tells us what to do. Kivalina leadership makes their own decisions. We have always been considered the troublemakers. In fact, I went all the way to Juneau to testify at a hearing. And before the hearing, we sat in a state legislator in his office waiting for the hearing to happen, and we were talking, and he said, there are some, and he wanted to warn me about it. He said, there are some people who are calling a handful of Kivalina people disenfranchised militants. And he was saying, they're going to ask you certain questions. They're going to ask you this question. And I said, I hope they do. I hope they do. Because, it's time for people to know that we make our own decisions. My dad is a whaling captain, and he spends a lot of time out in the ocean, and there aren't very many people who are very knowledgeable about the ocean, especially during whaling season. He's one of them. He's an elder. And what really surprised me recently was when he said, you just have to look at the clouds and you'll know if there's going to be a flood. That's how our people survive in the Arctic, through their observations about everything, the climate especially. They do that by looking at the snowdrifts, by looking at the stars. So they always find their way home. They have to be able to.
This is powerful stuff. And in our religious tradition, we have stories of floods. But the stories we have bring new hope and healing. And so we're seeing a story of flooding from those militants, those Alaskans, those indigenous folks. Put that into context for us. How has the church response and understanding of what's happening here and inform what we're doing? Yeah.
So the video that you just saw was actually one associated with our second case study of Kivalina Village, also Alaska, also predominantly Episcopalian. So I'll just finish up a little bit of words about the Gwich'in case and continue on with the Kivalina, if that sounds good to you all.
Sounds great.
Let's see here, because all of it is of a piece in terms of environmental climate change and impact. So let's grab that. Thank you. So one of the victories for the Gwich'in took place in response to the Tax Cuts and Job Act. In 2017, that was created, and the steering committee responded with lawsuits against the administration at that time. And at the same time, they also launched a corporate campaign that targeted oil companies and financial institutions that were funding those companies. Because as we all know, in dominant culture, money is what it's always been about. It has always been about what do we need to do to make money, and that is the exploitation of people and the exploitation of land, the exploitation and removal of indigenous communities on whose lands they have these resources. But they launched a corporate campaign that targeted oil companies and those financial institutions, which ultimately pressured various companies to not invest in Arctic drilling, making it financially unattractive for them to do so. Through this form of protest, which I think in dominant culture spoke the most loudly and was valued the most because it was about money instead of people. But through that form of protest, the Gwich'in were able to successfully deter those major banks in the US and Canada from funding Arctic drilling. And that kind of side then was the protection of the Arctic refuge. So at this point, indigenous people, what I find is we have to know how dominant culture works even better than most dominant culture people do, so that we can create forms of protest that have the punch that dominant culture is willing to respond to, because that's the only thing that seems to work. But today, ultimately, the Central Coast and the Arctic Refuge is still open for bidding and development. Congress has not closed the loophole originally created in 1988. Politicians, particularly those in Alaska, continue to support fossil fuel development in Area 1002. With the election of the Biden-Harris administration, Deb Haaland as head of the Department of the Interior, she is an indigenous woman, is a newfound hope for all of us in the protection of the Arctic. And in January of 2021, President Biden signed an executive order placing a temporary moratorium on oil and gas activity in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR. This moratorium does not place any permanent protections on Arctic Refuge quite yet, but it is a step in the right direction and shows that this administration may do a better job than its predecessors in listening to indigenous voices. But until then, it is a waiting game to see what decisions are made. And the environment, the Gwich'in people, and many other Arctic peoples continue to be pawns in a dominant culture global game of economic and resource exploitation. But no matter what happens, it is certain the Gwich'in will not give up their fight to protect their lands, their human rights, and their food sovereignty. I want to share with you, in conclusion of this part of our presentation, that since the early 1990s, the Episcopal Church has officially opposed drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Now, this commitment has been renewed several times, including at our most recent General Convention last year, because we believe that environmental injustices such as oil extraction, in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge is an assault on the Gwich'in people. It is an assault and violence to their way of life, and it is an assault against their faith. So in pursuit of eco-justice, the Episcopal Church has articulated our support for the Gwich'in self-determination and the self-determination of all indigenous tribes. We as a church organization internationally renounced the doctrine of discovery in 2009 for its political and theological applications and implications.
That's right.
And we have strived to include indigenous voices and indigenous ways of seeing the environment and living within it in ways that are far more attuned to our spirituality. So I'd like to turn to what you saw in that video, the example of the Arctic village of Kivalina. And I would share that the temperatures in the Arctic overall are rising at more than twice the rate of the global average, twice the rate in all Arctic areas. These resulting environmental changes have created violent ocean storms, flooding, and as you saw in the video of Kivalina, an erosion. But this erosion is also taking place beneath the homes of the people in Kivalina. The impacts have been traumatic to the barrier islands of the Inupiaq community of Alaska, because sea ice that was had once been in the ocean and protecting the island from winter storms that was so thick and kept those waves from flooding at bay, that sea ice is no longer forms early enough in the fall to prevent the rising waters and the storm surges from reaching that island shore. So patchy sea ice also makes winter travel across the ice and hunting very difficult and very dangerous. So Kivalina's environmental problems are not restricted to the coast, however, because as the permafrost thaws, the nearby river called the Wuluk River washes away large chunks of its own stream bank and increases river sediment that's caused great difficulty in treating the community water supply. So things you might not think about include the fact that the Kivalina people rely on ice cellars in the community of the permafrost that provide a year-round freezer for things like whale meat and caribou. As those ice cellars have begun to melt at very unusual times of the year, it's spoiled those kinds of food products that they rely upon and that they've been trying to store. So also because of the changes in the silt, then that buildup is changing the course of the river, which also affects the migration routes of the caribou. It reduces the availability of lands, the berries and greens that they rely upon, and the inability to hunt sea mammals because of the loss of the sea ice. All of these things have raised concern about the village food security. And not only do residents fear for their own safety because of that erosion and the ocean storms, but growing numbers of families are also facing critical hunger. So the warmer weather brings about these heavy snowstorms, and these coincide with increasing numbers of visits of the people to health clinics to treat high anxiety. So they have depression, anxiety, they have injuries related to trying to clear the snow, and they have losses and deaths because of falling through sea ice and attempting to hunt, and on and on and on. Russell Adams, Sr., who has been a lifelong resident of Kivalina, has said that the sea ice used to be 12 feet thick, and there was just one open lead. A lead in the sea ice is a way of water on the surface of the ice. There was only one open lead when it was 12 feet thick. However, now the sea ice is only 4 feet thick, and there are many more leads, making it far more dangerous. So another resident, Joe Swan Sr., has said the ice used to push migrating whales closer into the shore, and that's why we could hunt them. But now the ice is too thin, they do not come close, and we cannot go anywhere safely. So Kivalina has been in its current location since, before the 1900s. And then they built a school in the early 1900s there with the missionaries. And again, primarily Episcopalian. And in the 2000s, the community settled on a nearby, potentially safer site to get away from the land erosion. And they are looking at relocation. And the Army Corps of Engineers determined, however, that the new site that they were looking at in 2000 could and will also fall victim to climate change impacts over time. And so the hunt for a new place to relocate Kivalina continues. But in the meantime, the community has undertaken some measures to buy themselves some time. They have several beach projects that they're testing and that they've been testing over the past decade. Unfortunately, so far, all those kinds of projects have failed. One particularly costly effort failed in a large storm just days after its completion, and it worsened rather than improved the erosion. After visiting the damaged area of Kivalina, U.S. State Senator then Ted Stevens helped sponsor legislation to authorize erosion control projects in several of the communities of the area. And again, through the Army Corps of Volunteers, they completed a rock revetment in 2010, but the installation of the structure reduced the size of Kivalina. But it did buy the community at least another decade into 2020, which is already passed, trying to make a relocation decision, and they're still not able to do it. Since Kivalina is limited in its size by this encroaching sea, by the revetment, housing has become really scarce, and it's led to overcrowding, and the consequence of that has been really poor sanitation, which is again another immediate threat to the health of the people. Household sewage right now is hauled away in honey buckets to 4 different disposal bunkers throughout the community. So that solid waste has, although it's a mile away from town, it's posing contamination threat to fisheries during storms and flooding, to the lagoon that's just east of the city, and it lacks a perimeter fence. So it's attracting animals that are bringing another threat, which includes bears. To totally revamp that whole sanitation system, they are using a design called biochar sanitation. It's designed to turn human and solid waste into sustainable energy. So a group called the Climate Foundation, which is a winner of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Reinvent the Toilet Challenge, which I personally love, got a grant to work with the Kivalina leaders and also in their relocation efforts. And there's a whole group of artists actually working with the Kivalina leaders to develop not only a environmentally sustainable way of dealing with waste management, but also to redevelop their community in ways that are more integrated into the land and also highly attractive. The nearby Red Dog Mine employs a lot of the Kivalina residents, and it is also providing funding for this project. So it's a partnership of public-private partnerships that can help both parties thrive.
That's so exciting.
So working together, if I have one more moment, working together for permanent solutions, we estimate that the cost for relocation as they continue to increase, look right now about $400 million per person in Kivalina. $400 million by the time the project is completely done and relocated. So we continue to work for global support to find these permanent solutions. These things aren't going to go away anytime quickly. So we continue to ask for global partnerships and help as we work together to preserve the villages in Alaska. There are 229 tribes in Alaska. And if the Kivalina experiment goes well, they are all going to be helped also. Thank you so much for your time and listening, and I'd like to entertain questions.
Thank you. If there are questions, we're happy to entertain them. We'll also be able to come back to that too. And you brought up some really deep, complex places of pointing out the need, but also the hope and the ask. I want to also invite Susie, who is our government relations expert from the Episcopal Church, to talk about what does that translate into, these public-private partnerships, the potential to do great good and allyship and at the request of these communities. Susie, what are we hoping for this COP? What are we asking for our U.S. policy folks to help make these dreams and this intervention for the Gwich'in and the Inupiat and Kivalina and other places in Alaska happen?
Hello. Thank you so much, Melanie, and thank you to my wonderful co-panelists here for giving such a wonderful kind of lay of the land in this current situation. In terms of the COP, we work with our wonderful representative to the United Nations as well. We're the U.S. federal advocacy branch of the Episcopal Church. So that's our mandate, is to advocate to the U.S. federal government. And I do have a brief slide deck here just to better explain some of our work. There we go. So as the Office of Government Relations, we work with our grassroots network of Episcopalians known as the Episcopal Public Policy Network. And so we work with them to basically advocate on federal policy to the US government. Our mission is to advocate and convey the policy priorities of the Episcopal Church to the US government to help shape policy and legislation, public perspectives to align with the Church's priorities, and then highlight the voices and experiences of Episcopalians and Anglicans globally. And so I think that really ties into everything that Rachel was discussing earlier in terms of our Episcopalians who are in these dire circumstances up in near and around the Arctic Refuge. The Episcopal Public Policy Network, which we're so grateful for all of those advocates, our mission for them is to help educate them and connect on General Convention and Executive Council resolutions. These are where we get all of our mandates. So it's not coming directly from the presiding bishop, it's coming from General Convention and Executive Council. And those are where our work begins in terms of telling us how to advocate, what to advocate for. And then we also equip the Episcopal Public Policy Network with all the resources that they may need in order to help engage in these conversations, and then also help them engage by helping them facilitate policy conversations, both with other Episcopalians and then and also with government officials. And we do this as we are rooted in the Anglican Communion, as the third largest Christian body and just such an international entity. And so, yes, and that's both at the Anglican Communion and then also the international aspect of the church, of the Episcopal Church specifically. We work on a variety of different policy areas. We are focusing more on the creation care and care of creation, as well as but they tie in together in so many interconnected ways. And so this is an Indigenous issue that has environmental components to it. So there's a way for those areas to overlap when we're talking about the public policies involved. But as Rachel said, we're also dealing with internal migration, right? If with a region that might have to just fully relocate. And that's another area that we work on, as well as ending poverty and then human rights and peace. And so why do we advocate? And so we believe there's three main reasons for that. One is scripture, says in Proverbs 31, speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of the destitute, speak out and judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. And so we feel called to it through our scripture. We also know that advocating to the US federal government has a type of scale that the Episcopal Church cannot achieve on its own. We are a much smaller entity. The US federal government has just an enormous power, both domestically and internationally. And so just one policy I want to name in terms of that type of scale, the Clean Air Act, which was passed several decades ago, has been estimated to prevent over 2,300,000 premature deaths in the United States. And that's from one policy. And so those are the types of things that we're looking to help influence and ensure pass to make sure that we can do good in this world, right? And as we are called to do. And then, of course, the US government has an enormous amount of authority that the Episcopal Church doesn't. On foreign policy, environmental regulation, energy transition, all of those areas, they just have a lot more authority than we do. And so how do we advocate? And so this is where I'll get into a little bit more about the Arctic specifically. As I mentioned earlier, all of our work comes from General Convention and Executive Council resolutions, and that includes our guidance for the Arctic Refuge specifically. So this, it was first named in the General Convention of 1991, and since then we have been actively working on this issue to prevent oil production in the Arctic Refuge. Kind of more specifically the coastal plain, as Rachel kind of broke down the reason why that's more desirable in terms for oil development perspective. And so that's where our call comes from. And that resolution specifically mentions the Gwich'in people. And so that's been in our work for over 30 years now. And it has been a really important piece of, especially my work specifically as an environmental policy analyst. And so we do this both in coalition with other organizations that are working on this issue to get the Arctic Refuge permanently protected. And so there is a bill in Congress right now that we have been in support of, and we've actually encouraged our Episcopal Public Policy Network to take action on. And this bill would permanently protect the Arctic Refuge from drilling. This is a bill that has been brought up several times in Congress. Kind of every year, every new Congress, until the Arctic Refuge is protected, we expect to see it, and we advocate for this bill to ensure that that area is protected by the federal government permanently. As Rachel mentioned before, the Biden administration had set into a moratorium on leasing in the area. In addition to that, this year they also canceled 2 lease sales in the region. I will just say that this has been contested in the court system, but it is a step in showing the administration's willingness to take this issue really seriously and listen to voices in the region who have been asking for permanent protection since the Reagan administration kind of opened it up for development. And so we continue our work in coalition to ensure that a bill like this, this one I was referencing earlier, would permanently protect it and just can't prevent any further lease sales, basically, in addition to preventing anybody from actually drilling in the area. It's important to know that while those lease sales had happened, none of the production elements had gone into place. So there was no actual drilling that had started yet, even though the lease sales had gone through. And this is in part thanks to the amazing work that Rachel mentioned earlier about kind of the very, very smart tactics in terms of getting insurance companies to not be willing to fund or support these oil companies in their drilling, which is just a really amazing way to go about this type of advocacy. So thanks to those types of work, it's made drilling in the region quite undesirable, even when people have had the lease sales. And so I do encourage you to join us in this call. Join the Episcopal Public Policy Network if you're interested in learning more about this and so many other issues that we advocate on, both in terms of creation care and Indigenous issues, as well as so many other areas as well, and help us advocate to Congress and also to the White House, the State Department, and other federal agencies. We do engage a bit with the private sector as well. But that is normally, in terms of our mandate, we focus on the federal government. The private sector piece comes mostly in corporate and social responsibility, which is obviously important in terms of projects. And there's been a lot of advocacy to ensure that the environment is talked about really explicitly in terms of investing in areas like that. And so we remain engaged in those conversations, as do other groups in the Episcopal Church. So I do encourage you to check out our website if you'd like to know more, not just on the bill that I was referencing earlier. And I also just want to say that in terms of this COP and previous COPs, advocating to the US federal government is such a key step after the COP is over to ensure that the promises made get upheld and to make sure that those voices remain strong and steadfast to keep our government accountable for its promises that it makes during these types of international discussions. So I believe I will end there, but thank you for listening, and thank you for hosting such an amazing panel today.
Thank you, Susie, and an amen to that. We know that just being allies in this struggle has shown us some work as citizens, that we have to push our governments to make and keep good commitments. But there are some futures of what we're learning from this that church and faith people can do to go even further. And so, Dr. Heck, tell us a little bit about what we can learn and what we can go and where the future of this work is happening and for us. And we have some slides for our speaker who's in the room with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Melanie. I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. This one's working. And if the PowerPoint slides can, there we go. And they're not running quite yet. While we're waiting for this to come up, you'll see here the logo of the Gwich'in people, and you'll notice how central the caribou is to the tribe, and has been, as they said, for 14,000 years. So we heard Susie and others talk about the fact that since 1991, the Episcopal Church has opposed oil development in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. But it took us a while as a church to develop a real concept of environmental justice. And it wasn't until 2012 that our governing body came out with our first resolution to seek environmental justice. There were some minor things that happened along the way, but in 2018, we did a number of things that were very important in the history of the church. One was a resolution where we came out, the House of Bishops passed a resolution being in solidarity with the Gwich'in people, and they urged us as a church to use prayer, advocacy, public witness, and whatever legal means we could use on their behalf. Because they finally, as a body, began to understand the role that the porcupine caribou herd played in the people's lives. And perhaps, maybe most importantly, we began to shift our approach to ours as the white colonizing church, telling people what to do, to listening, which is key for us as a church, to respect the wisdom and the authority of these elders and leaders, and to step aside and allow them to be the voices, and that we walk beside them, as Bishop Mark said. So in 2018, we created the first task force on creation care and environmental racism. We'd had creation care bodies before, but it was the first time that we added environmental racism. We named that sin within the church. And we had a representation of indigenous voices. And I really wish that Bernadette was the one that was here talking to you, because that would be the most appropriate. She is back in Alaska doing the advocacy work that she does best. But I will show you a picture of her in just a few moments. And Bernadette talked about her story. And she talks about the role of storytelling within her community. And at the same time, the work that Susie and her colleagues were doing on Capitol Hill collided, so to speak. And we had the U.S. government had their very first convening on environmental justice and environmental racism on Capitol Hill. And we went, Melanie and I and some others, and we talked to the Dr. Robert Bullard, who is the father of the environmental justice movement in the U.S. And we asked, what do we do to tell this story? And Dr. Bullard said, make maps. And turns out that I teach students how to make maps. And so we are taking the church into a new form of storytelling. And we have tied that with a grants program, because it's one thing to teach people how to tell a story with maps, but if you challenge them to go into their neighborhood and to redress the wrongs, the environmental racism and the historical legacies, but you don't offer any additional funding along the way, then you're just a talking mouth, right? We have to provide the education, we have to find the advocacy tools, and then finally, we have to include the youth, because as with many churches right now, the Episcopal Church is getting grayer, as you can see. And we have established an Eco-Justice Fellows program, because when you show them the technology, you show them once and they're off, right? I have to show adults like me many times how to use the technology, and then maybe they get it. But you show the youth once and they're gone. They make their maps. So I'm going to show you some maps that we now use in our neighborhood tool that is available to every Episcopalian and every parish in the entire country. So this is one, and these little black dots are all of the Episcopal parishes. These are the ones in Alaska, and I'm not sure. The one in the eye, or on the coast here near the Brooks Range, that is Catalina, and the one in the very top, farthest north towards the east, that is Arctic Village. So those are the two case studies we've been talking about. And so this map shows us the percentages of population that are below the poverty level last year. And you can see the wide swath across Alaska of Episcopal churches that have greater than a quarter of the population living in poverty. Okay. We can show, and this is the wrong scale, but the yellow part here, this is our environmental justice layer that the EPA puts out. That is where Catalina is. That is showing that in that district, that 90 to 95%, it's in the 90 to 95 percentile of harmful air toxin release in the U.S. So not only is that village being impacted by sea level rise and erosion, it is also facing some very serious air pollution issues. We can then look at health insurance. So you have issues of poverty. All of these villages and parishes are in areas that have very high levels of no health insurance. So you have poverty, no health insurance, you have environmental issues. But we have a little hope. This is, and obviously this is for part of the year because it is in the Arctic, the annual amount of incoming solar radiation. So if we start thinking about how do we move from fossil fuels, it's going to be in all of the above minus fossil fuels, that these are areas that have very high potential for part of the year using solar energy. There are also areas for proposed hydroelectric sites. So all of the blue dots are good places for hydroelectric power. And the brown dots are sites for geothermal plants. So, and you can see the black, that's the Alaska pipeline, right? That there are lots of potential for alternative energy sites within Alaska. So we can also look at infrastructure. So when we look, this is St. Thomas, this is the church in Catalina. We can see how close the village is to the sea levels. We can see the type of infrastructure that's impacted by it. And we can put all of these layers together. for a more complete analysis. We can see this is when Reverend Rachel was talking about the wetlands. We can see how these wetlands will expand as the tundra is melting, and how, as sea level rises occur, the village will be threatened. So I want to end with this picture. This is part of the steering committee. Bernadette, yes, is the one right in the middle there, right where the arrows are. She is the one whose voice should be speaking today, but she has loudly and forcefully, along with her community members, been making the argument that this Arctic region has to be protected, and that the porcupine caribou who've been there for 14,000 years have just as much right to live, and that their way of life has no less value than those of us sitting here today. And so we are taking the stories that they have told for generation upon generation and finding new ways to tell that story in a digital way so that we can spread this story to the rest of the world. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Delia, and thank everyone who has helped us tell not just the story of the devastating effects of climate change and of fossil fuel extraction, but the story of how we can hear in all new ways that community is learning, that church is, as Reverend Rachel told us, re-peopling, re-spiriting, and reframing. And so we're open to questions from you all as we wrap up this busy day of hearing not just about the places in which there is so much need and so much to be done, but the places in which we're learning as church to do better. We are taking the idea of sacrifice from our spirituality and learning that there are no longer sacrifice communities or sacrifice zones and people, and instead we are moving forward in effort and hope. Yes. Go for it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Nobuyuki Asai from Sokagaka International. I'm from Tokyo, Japan. And I had no idea about what kind of advocacy you are promoting. So yeah, now I learned little. But on top of that, yeah, I wonder if you are conducting advocacy to individual congressmen, and also if that's the case, do the congressmen include both Republicans and Democrats?
Yeah, I will say definitely, and I can speak for Susie, who's somewhere in the atmosphere. We, as a church, according to our laws, are nonpartisan. So we might have our affinities, but we work with all sides of the aisle. And some of our best advocates, depending on the issue, are Republicans, are Democrats. And so we work with everyone, especially local people, because politics is local, and that's how we move people. You're absolutely right. Thank you. If there are any other questions, and I know our folks on the screen are, they're texting me and telling me that they're really glad and want to know that Princess Johnson of the Gwich'in and Inupiat communities in Alaska, the Bishop of Alaska, and all folks are there who are supporting this work. And as we mentioned before, working across the aisle and across politics and decisions. Any final thoughts or hopes or charges for us? And I'm looking at Bishop Mark because I know you have been such a staunch advocate. It's getting the faith version of climate advocacy out there.
Thanks, Melanie. I just have been sending text in our group saying what a fantastic panel. I want to especially thank Reverend Rachel Tabor Hamilton, not a member of the delegation until week 2. She's about to make her advent in person there, but taking the opportunity and the effort to tell a full story that's so important. And Princess Desiree Johnson, thank you for mentioning her, Melanie. a member of the Gwich'in people, was in our first delegation to the COP back in Paris in 2015, along with a deacon from the Lakota people. So from the very beginning, we've been blessed by being a delegation that has been led and partnered with Indigenous people. And I wanted to thank Colleen Swan, who is the narrator for the Kivalina video. Colleen is a longtime advocate for Kivalina and speaks with tremendous authority within her community and within the Episcopal Church. So great thanks to everyone. I learned from each of the panelists myself and feel like I've been blessed today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yeah. Melanie, can I just really quickly say how much I appreciate the efforts of the Episcopal Church to include Indigenous people like myself and others in these efforts, so that the Episcopal Church it proves to me, is leaving the old paradigm of we're going to talk about Indigenous people, we're going to advocate about Indigenous people, but rather to work with. So I really appreciate walking forward in partnership in this way, so that whatever is about us is actually with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Amen. And let us go in peace to save this world. Thanks. Bye.